Good evening, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you all had a good day today, and I'm sure this is going to be the cherry on the top. We begin the session for the 46th Gopalan Oration Award, and I would like to invite Dr. R. Hemalata, President NSI, Dr. Sheshikaran, immediate past President NSI, Dr. S. Kaushalya, Joint Secretary NSI, and a big hand for Dr. Professor Carolyn Fall, recipient of the Gopalan Award, Oration Award. I now request our President, Dr. Hemalata ma'am, to present a welcome gift to Professor Fall. And Dr. Sheshikaran to present a memento to Dr. Kaushalya. Thank you very much. Please be seated. We'll now begin the session. I invite Dr. Kaushalya, Joint Secretary, to tell us about the award.
Good evening and namaste to all members of NSI present here. This is a prestigious award section. Dr. C. Gopalan, all of us know, called Kulathur Gopalan. The Gopalan Oration Award was instituted in the year 1974 by the Nutrition Society of India in honor of its founder president, Dr. C. Gopalan, who has been the guiding force behind the society since its inception. In his capacity as a founder president and as a permanent executive committee member, Dr. Gopalan has nurtured the society and has built it up to its present stature. The society as it is today bears testimony to his genius as an architect and father of nutritional sciences in India. His contribution towards the betterment of nutrition of population has benefited not only India, but other developing countries as well. It has helped to strengthen and inspire movements for the eradication of undernutrition among the underprivileged in many third world countries. He was the first Asian to be elected as the president of the International Union of Nutrition Sciences and the first chairman of the Regional Advisory Committee on Medical Research for Southeast Asia of WHO. He was the elected fellow of the Royal Society of London. He was also the first Nuffield Foundation Fellow from India and Medical Research Council of United Kingdom and a Rockefeller Foundation Fellow. The National Institute of Nutrition, NIN Hyderabad, India, was nurtured by Dr. Gopalan with rare dedication as its director from 1960 to 1974. Dr. Gopalan was also responsible for forging a fraternity of Asian nutrition scientists and initiating the first Asian Congress of Nutrition and promoting the subsequent ones, which led to the formation of the Federation of Asian Nutrition Societies. He was an able administrator and a visionary. During his tenure as the director of NIN, later as the Director General of ICMR, the country as a whole focused its attention on nutritional and medical problems of public health importance. Under his leadership, a wealth of information was generated to tackle problems such as protein energy malnutrition, vitamin A deficiency, phrinoderma, lathyrism, fluorosis, and pellagra. The foundation of the National Nutrition Monitoring Bureau was laid by him. Dr. Gopalan has also created the Nutrition Foundation of India. Some of the renowned national and international honors bestowed on him for his outstanding contributions include Dr. B.C. Roy National Award 1974, Dhanvantri Award in 1978, WHO Health for All Medal 1988, Sir C.V. Raman Gold Medal of the Indian National Science Academy 1988, International Union of Nutritional Sciences Award in 1989, R.D. Bilra Award in 1990, and Fellow of the International Union of Nutritional Sciences in 1993, and ICMR NIN Centenary Award recently in 2018. He was also conferred the prestigious civilian awards Padma Shri in 1970 and Padma Bhushan in 2003 by the Government of India. The Living Legend Awards from International Union of Nutritional Sciences IUNS 2003 and Federation of Asian Nutrition Societies FANS in 2019. Dr. Gopalan passed away after 100 fruitful years of life on 3rd October 2019. The Gopalan oration is given every year to an expert who has made significant contributions in the field of nutrition and allied sciences. NSI is proud to announce that the 45th Gopalan oration will be delivered by Professor Caroline Fall, Emeritus Professor of International Pediatric Epidemiology, MRC Life Course Epidemiology Center, University of Southampton, Southampton General Hospital, UK, on mothers, babies, and health in later life. Let's give a big hand to Madam for receiving this prestigious award, and I could feel the presence of late Dr. Gopalan, not only as a tall scientist here, but his blessings and as a father of the nutritional sciences of India today amongst us. His blessings for the 2023 will take us forward to emphasize our needs for the community. Thank you, organizers, for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. I now invite Dr. Shashikaran to introduce the recipient.
It's indeed an honor to introduce the orator for today. Professor Caroline Fall studied her medicine at Bristol University, UK, followed by training and practice in general pediatrics and pediatric endocrinology and diabetes. She joined the MRC Life Course Epidemiology Unit at the University of Southampton in 1989 to work with Professor David Barker, whose research into the development origins of adult health and disease, the acronym DOHAD, was becoming known. And all of you, or most of you, will recall many years ago, Professor David Barker himself gave the Gopalan oration here in one of our NSI meetings. And her early work linked low birth weight to an increased risk of adult type 2 diabetes in UK Hertfordshire's birth cohort. From 1993 onwards, she developed collaborations with researchers in India, focusing on the programming effects of maternal and child nutrition on adult body composition, cardiometabolic health, and cognitive function. People remember Ranjan Yagnik and others were involved in that study. And she has also led research in adolescent nutrition in India and sub-Saharan Africa. Professor Fall won the International DOHAD Society's David Barker Medal in 2013 for outstanding leadership in the field of DOHAD research, and the March of Dimes Agnes Higgins Award in 2019 for her contributions to research in maternal nutrition. She has published over 300 original research papers. Madam, we on behalf of the Gopalan Oration Trust are very grateful to you for having readily accepted and having taken the time out to travel to India to deliver this oration. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. We will now have the felicitation. Dr. Hemlata, President NSI, will felicitate Dr. Caroline Fall, recipient of the 46th Gopalan Oration Award. A big round of applause, please. And the citation, madam. We will now have the oration lecture by Professor Fall on mothers, babies, and health in later life.
Can everyone hear me all right? Yeah, great. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Dr. Shashikaran, Dr. Lakshmaya, Dr. Hemalata, for inviting me. I consider it an enormous honor to be invited to give this lecture. And I also recognize the importance of actually being here in person rather than doing this down the dreaded Zoom yet again. We've somewhat forgotten how to speak in public, haven't we, in front of real people, but it's very important. This is a picture of the ice crystals in my garden on the day that I left the UK to come here, day before yesterday. It looks very beautiful, but it's somewhat uncomfortable. So I'm very grateful for the warm welcome that I've received here. So thank you for that. I did have the good fortune to meet Dr. Gopalan twice and to have the opportunity to talk with him at quite some length. And the thing that I remember most was that at his then advanced age, much older than the picture here, the intensity with which he listened to what we were doing and the great encouragement he gave, especially to me as a very young researcher at that time. I'm going to start my main talk by paying tribute to another person, and this is Professor David Barker, who's been a great inspiration to my career, both as a physician and as a researcher. He was researching the pattern of death rates from coronary heart disease within our tiny country, where there were as much as threefold differences according to the area where you lived and whether you were going to die prematurely as an adult from ischemic heart disease. And he was intrigued by this. There was no good explanation for it. The great characteristic of David was that he could look at data and information that many others had looked at before and passed over as being uninteresting, and he could see something completely new in it. And one of my favorite examples of this phenomenon is the story of Nelson, Cole, and Burnley, which are 3 towns in the north of England, sitting side by side along the edge of the Pennine Hills, just north of Manchester. And in 1987, it was known that the mortality from heart disease was much higher in Colne and Burnley than in Nelson. Nelson had a death rate about average for the UK. Cole and Burnley had death rates about 20% higher, a significant difference. And yet everything that people measured in those 3 towns was just the same. They had a similar industrial history, they had the same climate, identical, they had the same pollution and smoking levels, socioeconomic status, and very similar medical services. What David did by going with meticulous care through very ancient archived records was to build up a picture of the past in those 3 towns, where he found that there had been very great differences. So all these 3 towns were Lancashire cotton mill towns. But in Nelson, the place with the best future mortality, the women were more recent migrants from the rich agricultural rural areas. They were much better nourished throughout their childhood. They were healthy and sturdier, taller. They breastfed their infants for longer. The housing in Nelson was newer, less damp, more spacious, and the waste pits were looked after much better, disinfected regularly, And all of these advantages in Nelson, back then, 100 years ago, were evident in infant mortality, which was much higher in Colne and Burnley than in Nelson. And the housing was much better. And David's conclusion from that paper, and I do recommend reading that paper just for fun, because it is such an interesting thought process. He concluded, "We suggest that explanations for current geographical differences in mortality in Britain may be found in maternal characteristics and the environmental conditions that determine past differences in child development." This was quite a revolutionary idea. But another characteristic of David was that he pursued this idea doggedly and with great determination to follow it to its logical conclusion. And this is the data that he actually then became well known for. This is data from the Hertfordshire birth cohort, which had data on birth weight and weight at 1 year, showing that mortality rates from ischemic heart disease were strongly influenced or strongly related to birth weight and weight at 1 year of an individual. And if you look at these contour lines, you can see that at the top right are the men and women who were heavy at birth and heavy at the age of 1 year. Bottom left, the babies who were small at birth and 1 year. And there's about a 3-fold difference in their adult mortality from ischemic heart disease. And he felt this was further evidence that the health of mothers, which was a strong determinant of birth weight, and the environmental conditions in which babies were born into, which determined the weight at the age of 1 year, were an important underlying cause of that later coronary heart disease. I joined his group in exactly that year, and I was immediately dispatched up to Hertfordshire to track down people who were born in the county in the early 20th century and were still living there. And we dragooned these people into clinics and measured their ischemic heart disease risk factors. They were very generous with their time. So I was lucky to make this discovery, which is that having type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes was also related to having a lower birth weight or a lower weight at 1 year. And I think people know the birth weight bit, they sometimes forget the weight at 1 year bit, which I think is very important. I think this is also one of the most important slides in my talk this evening. It's an old finding, and I can sometimes feel the audience switch off when I put up this information. But again, I think it's a very profound finding, which we find so consistently in every cohort that we look at it, including in India. This is percentages of men and women with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes according to their weight at birth and their adult BMI category. And you can see, I hope, if I can get the pointer there, that the worst place to be is a small birth weight baby who becomes an obese adult. And the best place to be is a high birth weight baby who remains a slim adult. But there's more to it than that, because you can see that if you were a small baby, the effect of being an obese adult is much stronger, it's a much steeper slope than if you were a high birth weight baby. Similarly, if you were a high birth weight baby, you can be obese and not have a high risk of diabetes. So there's an interaction between birth weight and BMI. It is extremely important from this data, if you were a low birth weight baby, that you remain slim as an adult. Now, this is another twist to the story of birth weight. As soon as we published the Hertfordshire findings, Many other studies around the world were done in a similar way, using birth records and tracing the outcomes in adult life. And so we have a lot of data now on birth weight and later diabetes. And you can see in the dark blue line there that almost all of these studies show the same thing that we found in Hertfordshire, with a higher risk of diabetes at the low birth weight end and an inverse relationship so that the heavier babies were less at risk. But there was one study, the US Nurses study, which is in the USA, huge study, where they found a little upkick at the high birth weight end. It was a reverse J-shaped relationship. So there was trouble at high birth weight too. And because this was such a big study, they were able to identify that that was caused by maternal gestational diabetes, which causes higher birth weight, of course. And then studies in the Pima Indian population, which have a high rate of gestational diabetes, there was actually a U-shaped relationship between your birth weight and later diabetes. At the lower birth weight end, this was associated with fetal growth restriction. At the upper end, this was due to macrosomia as a result of your mother having diabetes when you were in utero. So what was called the Barker hypothesis and later became the Dohad hypothesis starts with the concept that fetal and early postnatal development is an orchestrated process. Every structure, every tissue must develop in sequence and at the right time during its critical period. The process is plastic, very malleable by the environment, which is, of course, the mother. And several metabolic tissues develop during that time and can become fixed at a very young age. So deficits in the environment at that time can have permanent effects, a phenomenon that David called programming, leaving a lower metabolic capacity and vulnerability to the diseases that we're talking about. So this is the same thing in picture form, talking about the low birth weight story, that a fetus that is undernourished, either because the mother's undernourished or because she can't get nutrients to the fetus for whatever reason. This impairs the development of key metabolic tissues, partly through having inadequate nutrients and building blocks to develop them, partly because the fetus also adapts to favor certain tissues, thus depriving other tissues. The result being that there is altered development of key organs, either singly or multiply, depending on the timing and the duration of this situation. And that leads to a vulnerability to heart disease, hypertension, type 2 diabetes. And crucially, that vulnerability becomes expressed, if you like, especially under the stressor of later obesity. And the reason that the epidemics of heart disease and type 2 diabetes is partly because that is the trigger, the later stressor of our increasing adiposity on a background of fetal or infant deprivation. Now, this work was very soon followed by a great deal of animal model work, and this is just a slide showing the exposures in utero that have been related in animals to the later development of diabetes in the offspring. It's not just nutrition, although that is important. It's not just undernutrition, it can also be excess nutrients reaching the fetus, as in the case of gestational diabetes. But other stimuli such as stress, glucocorticoid exposure, maternal smoking, maternal exposure to pollutants and toxins. These can all have very specific effects on specific tissues in specific ways and lead to either impaired insulin secretion or insulin resistance and the disease of diabetes. And these studies have also shown evidence that it's epigenetic changes in the fetus or even earlier in the embryo that carries the memory of that early adversity. The implications of the hypothesis are that it may be possible to prevent disease at a much earlier stage of life than we tend to do at the moment. If you could improve the environment for the fetus and the infant, you can improve the development of all of those tissues and structures, and you can prevent diabetes in a primordial way, perhaps, increase the resilience of that fetus. You may also, while doing that, improve many other tissues. And it's important to know that the birth weight story is not just about diabetes and heart disease, it's also about chronic renal disease, chronic lung disease, mental ill health, and also a better grown baby is going to have better cognitive function. So this is important for many of our human capital functions, if you like. Now, I'm not saying that intervening late in life is not important. Of course it is. So what we do at the moment is shown in that purple arrow at the top. We tend to wait until someone has some sort of indication of disease before we step in and say, right, you've got to lose weight now, you've got to change your diet, you've got to stop smoking. And that's important, but the benefit stops with that individual. If you could improve the capacity of the individual early in life, you also have the possibility of transmitting that benefit on to the next generation. So this is the stage we had reached by about the early 1990s, and we were very aware of the problem of diabetes in India. It's not the country with the highest prevalence of diabetes in the world, but it's one of the highest. There are thought to be 90 million people with diabetes at the moment in the Indian subcontinent. In India itself, 70 million. Numbers that are just too big to really take in. But what's perhaps more frightening is the rate of rise of diabetes. So this is a tremendously important disease here. And we were also aware that India has a very high prevalence of low birth weight babies. At that time, it had a mean birth weight here of 2.7 to 2.8 kilograms, and a quarter of babies were born low birth weight, mainly due to growth restriction. And so David asked me to come here and start building research collaborations with research groups in India, which I've done and enjoyed doing very much ever since. And over those years, we have built up a network of research groups and birth cohorts in whom we are studying these issues. Now, I'm not going to go through this slide in detail, but it shows most of the cohorts that I've been working with. I don't want to imply these are the only cohorts working on DOHAD in India, because there are many others, including the famous APCAPS cohort here in Hyderabad. But these are the ones I have personally worked with. So they range, if you look from the bottom, from people aged in their 70s and 80s, based on birth records, with very little early life data beyond birth weight. They go up through the Vellore and New Delhi birth cohorts, which were started in the 1960s for an entirely different reason, to look at infant mortality and birth weight, but which have now reached an age in midlife, and where there were extremely detailed records kept by the people who ran those cohorts on child growth. Then we come to the Pune Maternal Nutrition Study, the Mysore Parthenon Study, which were set up specifically to study DOHAD, with much greater information collected on the mother's health, the mother's nutrition, and the mother's diabetes and metabolism during pregnancy. And then the newest cohorts at the top, the Pune Revamp cohort, which is studying a new exposure in early life, preeclampsia, Sadhana Joshi's cohort, and the HELTI study, which is in purple because this is a trial, and I'll describe that a bit later. So I'm going to try and pick out what I think are some very key points from those cohorts. I can't possibly tell you everything. I'm going to stick with diabetes as my outcome because there's no way that I could do this for more than one outcome. So this is data from 3 cohorts, the Pune Children's Study, the Mysore Parthenon Study, and the New Delhi Birth Cohort. A and B are both studies of children at that point, and of course they don't have diabetes, but the outcome there is insulin resistance measured by HOMA. And I hope you can see, just looking at those graphs, that they show that same pattern that we saw in Hertfordshire. There was not necessarily a relationship with birth weight in the whole cohort, but you can see, if you look at the dark back row of those graphs, that the very steep effect that you get across the range of birth weight in the heaviest group is where you see the greatest movement in those graphs. Now, we've used the child's weight, child's BMI, and the adult's BMI in the New Delhi birth cohort. And they're just in thirds. And I want to make the point that even in the highest third, those children were not obese back then. Those adults in Delhi were not obese back then. There was some, but these are not very high BMIs. And although we see this pattern everywhere, we see it within each cohort. These are values within each cohort. So that is in graph A, it's just the highest third within that population. Now, we've been able to dissect this further in the New Delhi birth cohort, graph shown here. This graph shows the body mass index from birth up to the age of about 30 in Z-scores. The blue line is the BMI growth of the people who later were found to have diabetes, type 2 diabetes or pre-diabetes. And the graph is cleverly drawn so that 0 is the cohort average. So what you're seeing here is the pattern of BMI gain relative to the rest of the cohort. You can see that the people who developed diabetes were thin at birth, thinner still in infancy, and then started climbing relative to the rest of the cohort in BMI. They crossed the line at about 10 years of age, and they continued on upwards to become significantly more heavy as adults. So there's that thin in early life, becoming heavy in later life. We've seen that in those block diagrams. But I want to make the point that this is not about obese children, detecting obese children. Childhood obesity is important. It's a risk factor for sure. But most of these children were not visibly obese at that time. You can see that at the age of 10, they had an exactly identical mean BMI to the rest of the cohort who remained healthy. The key difference is that they were moving upwards in BMI. And that's something that you can only pick up if you measure children's BMI at several different occasions. And there are very few places in the world that are doing that. If you do have serial measurements of BMI, you can get quite good predictions of risk of diabetes later. But I think the paper that Harshi and I wrote on that topic is one of our least cited. It's not something that has taken off, and that's a debate that could take a whole lecture in itself. This is just to make the point that we see the same pattern in the Vellore birth cohort, shown on the right there. It had fewer time points to use, but more data at certain points in childhood, so you get these tighter confidence intervals. Exactly the same pattern. Now I want to talk for a few minutes about gestational diabetes. This has been studied in detail in the Mysore Parthenon study, which was started by Hill and Krishnaveni back in 1997 to look at the effect of gestational diabetes on the children. They followed up around 800 women who were pregnant and attending the clinics at the Holsworth Hospital. They were a young group. They had a higher BMI than average for India then, but it was still not very high. 7% developed gestational diabetes at that time. The incidence in the same hospital now is 15%, and the value for India as a whole is more like 20%. And you can see that the GDM babies were a bit heavier, as you'd expect, than the non-GDM babies, but they were not in the macrosomic range. 3.3 kilograms is what you'd think of as a normal birth weight, but these babies were clearly macrosomic. And the point I want to make there is that the infant of a gestationally diabetic mother here is likely to have two problems. Growth restriction, for the reasons that babies are smaller here, combined with excess of particular specific fuels coming across the placenta because of the mother's diabetes. Krishna Veni has followed up those children. They've now reached the age of 20. She's just studied them. And 90% of those children are still in follow-up, which I think is a remarkable achievement. And this is just a picture of their subscapular skin folds at the different ages from birth up to 20. And you can see that at birth they are fatter than the infants of non-diabetic mothers, and that difference becomes more obvious as time goes on. To the extent that 50% of the offspring of diabetic mothers are overweight or obese at 20, compared with 18% of the infants of non-diabetic parents. So this is a very significant effect. They also spend their childhood with higher fasting insulin concentrations. And these findings have now been subsequently replicated in the huge HAPO study across many countries, showing that the children of mothers with gestational diabetes have a high risk of prediabetes, overweight and obesity, and they have not only insulin resistance, but impaired insulin secretion as well. And there are other changes that Krishna Veni has detected. These are cardiovascular responses to a stress test, the TRIA stress test, showing that the infants of diabetic mothers, both in their teens and in adult life, have an increased cardiac output. And we don't know what that means at this point, but it could mean that there are cardiovascular changes already evident. So exposure to GDM is a consistent and strong risk factor for later type 2 diabetes. I will mention at this point and pick up again later that low maternal B12 concentrations were a risk factor for GDM. The rising prevalence of GDM in India is certain to fuel the rise of type 2 diabetes in the future and of obesity. We do know that good management of gestational diabetes, which has improved considerably everywhere in the last 20 years, does reduce the macrosomia and does reduce any of the newborn complications, but probably does not prevent that later adiposity and diabetes. And we think that is probably because it starts too late, that the early embryo is already exposed to those excess fuels, and that the interventions need to be earlier. I'm going to come on to the Pune Maternal Nutrition Study, which was set up by Dr. Yagnik in a very deprived rural setting in Maharashtra in 1993, recruiting preconceptional mothers, following them through the pregnancy, and then continuing to follow them now up into their 20s. And the main objective was to get good measurements of the maternal nutritional status and link that to the later health of the children. And I'm going to just make a few points from the 18-year follow-up of that study at this point. So again, he has a very high percentage of the cohort still in follow-up, which is a huge achievement. The mean BMI of these young adults is about 1.5 heavier than their parents, in other words, the women and their husbands that we recruited back in 1993. The height has gone up by 6 centimeters, the adult height. So the next generation has shown better growth. But 30% of those young adults had abnormal glucose tolerance. This is in a rural area with not a high BMI. And I think someone mentioned earlier that this is becoming a rural problem as well as an urban problem. The factors that predicted abnormal glucose tolerance at 18 were lower maternal BMI before pregnancy, higher maternal glucose concentrations in pregnancy, smaller birth length and head circumference, and of course, greater adiposity at age 18, so the risk factors that we've been talking about. But Dr. Yagnik also had glucose concentrations measured through the childhood of these individuals, and there was a very strong correlation between the child's glucose and glucose tolerance at the age of 6 years with that when they reached adulthood. And it turns out that your plasma glucose as a child gives better predictions of your later risk of diabetes than the BMI does. And that's probably because it's telling you what you really want to know, how the metabolism is coping in that child who had a low birth weight and is transitioning. And so if you combine childhood glucose with birth size, with parents' glucose tolerance and the mother's glucose tolerance during pregnancy, plus the current body weight, you get predictions around the 70% mark, which is reaching the useful level. I think this needs to be refined. It needs to be replicated in our other cohorts. But we are reaching a point where you might be able to pick up the children who are at risk and maybe start to do something about it. Now, I've got to this point in my talk and I've hardly mentioned nutrition. So this is very briefly what we found in the Pune maternal nutrition study relating the mother's nutritional status to fetal growth and to later outcomes. We found that maternal height and weight, BMI height, were extremely strongly related to birth weight, as we know. You can't have a large baby if you're underweight and stunted as a mother. Physical workload was important, particularly very strenuous physical farming work. Of the dietary elements, green leafy vegetables, milk and dairy products, and fruit were all positively related to birth weight, with quite big differences of 100 to 200 grams between lowest and highest frequencies of intake. So this was more about diet quality and diversity than macronutrient adequacy. Of the micronutrients that we measured, we found that B12 and folate concentrations in the mother were positively related to birth size, and homocysteine, which can be a sign of vitamin B12 or folate deficiency, was inversely related to birth weight. So one of our first pointers that the one carbon cycle might be something to do with this, which was interesting because of the role that that cycle plays in DNA methylation, which, as I mentioned, we think carries the memory of the early environment. Similarly, when the children reached the age of 8 years, we found that insulin resistance in the children was also related to B12, but in a surprising way. So higher maternal B12 in pregnancy, but lower folate was associated with better, lower insulin resistance, lower risk of future diabetes. So just to sum up what I've said so far, these are the early life risk factors that these studies and other studies around the world have revealed for type 2 diabetes in adult life. Elevated maternal glucose before conception as well as in pregnancy. Micronutrient deficiencies, various, but including here in the studies here, B12 and folate. Small birth size, poor fetal growth, weight faltering during infancy, and then rapid adiposity gain and low physical activity. And of course, that childhood part of that diagram has increased greatly in India in virtually every setting because of the rapidity of transition. And you see that particularly strongly in the Pune maternal nutrition study, which was a drought-prone area with very high levels of malnutrition 20 years ago, but is now quite a prosperous area with industries, irrigation, and much more money. And that transition is more obvious. Now, until now, what I've been presenting to you have all been associations, epidemiological associations. And of course, that's not enough to build a policy on, because associations can be tricky. You never know exactly what is cause and what is effect from these observational studies, and what we need are intervention studies. There have been interventions of history in relation to this, and there are a number of studies which have shown that there are peaks in incidence of type 2 diabetes in the years when people reach, when people who were born during famine reach adult life. And I think that's shown particularly clearly here in this very big Austrian data set. People born during or immediately after famine have a higher rate of diabetes. This is a kind of intervention by history. Similarly, there is a great deal of evidence in animal models that you can intervene and prevent diabetes in the offspring through nutritional means. But these are not going to tell us what we really need to know about how to help the human situation. As you could see from my figure, there are several places where we might intervene. We might intervene to improve maternal nutrition or other conditions before and during pregnancy, improve fetal development, and increase metabolic capacity. We might intervene to try and reduce maternal obesity or prevent gestational diabetes. Or we might intervene in children and adolescents to try and pick up children at risk because of their past intrauterine or infant experience and try and mitigate that and prevent disease. And amongst the groups that I've been working with, what we call the SNEHA network, we have or are doing trials under all of those categories. But the one type of intervention closest to my heart, and the one that seems to be dealing most strongly with the root cause of the problem, are the interventions among women before and during pregnancy to try and improve the very beginning, the fetal development. And all of the trials that we have been involved with have started preconceptionally. And the reason for that is that there's increasing evidence that by the time the woman knows she's pregnant, the embryo and early fetus has been exposed to those adverse nutritional or metabolic problems, and the damage is already done, and that you do need to start before pregnancy. The first trial that we did was Project Saras in Mumbai with Dr. Ramesh Poddar, and this was a food-based study. We spent 2 or 3 years developing a snack made from local foods, green leafy vegetables, fruit and milk, in an attempt to get the intakes of those foods into the upper quartile of the Pune distribution. These were taken once a day in addition to normal diet, and there were control snacks which looked similar on the outside but did not have those micronutrient-rich foods in them. They provided between 10% and 23% of a range of micronutrients. Now we know that these snacks increased the levels in the mums of some micronutrients but not others. They increased beta-carotene and N3 fatty acid levels, but didn't increase B12, iron, calcium, or folate. They had an effect on birth weight, increasing birth weight by about 100 grams, but only in mothers who were not underweight. The birth weight was not increased in the thinnest mothers. An unexpected finding was that gestational diabetes was halved amongst the mothers that had this intervention, which is a big effect. We have recently followed up the children at the age of between 5 and 8. This is recently published, and the data is shown here. And I've shown different outcomes: children's height, body composition, systolic blood pressure, lipids, glucose and insulin, cognitive function, and bone mineral density. And the bottom line is that none of those were benefited by this intervention. There's no evidence that we benefited the child's metabolic capacity. In fact, if you looked at the adiposity of the children, we found that amongst girls in the intervention group, they were slightly more adipose than girls in the control group. So we may have made those girls a little bit more adipose with that intervention. Again, we don't know what that means at the moment. Is that a good or a bad thing in an undernourished population? For this reason, and for the fact that we reduced gestational diabetes, I think it is extremely important to keep following these children. But at the moment, our feeling is that this intervention was not enough. It hasn't achieved what we wanted it to do, either because there was not enough in those snacks, or because the mothers are dealing with so many other adversities that just giving them more GLVs and fruit is just not enough to help them. But this is something that's going to take time to completely answer. The second trial I want to tell you about is the PRIA trial, the Pune vitamin B12 trial by Dr. Yagnik, where he has supplemented a group of adolescent girls and boys, actually, with B12 in 3 groups: B12 alone at a physiological dose, B12 with multiple micronutrients, and standard care. And he has nested this study within the Pune maternal nutrition study so that the participants are the young adults who were the babies that were born in the Pune maternal nutrition study. And the intervention was started at around the age of 18 after one of the follow-up rounds. And we all expected the girls to get married and start having babies. And of course, this is a huge intergenerational change. The girls did not get married. They went and got good educations, went and worked in Mumbai and all over Maharashtra and beyond. And so the trial lasted 8 years in the end, waiting for these adolescent girls to take B12 and then go on to produce the next generation. So it has been a difficult study. And of course, ethically, he had to exclude girls who were B12 deficient by the standard criteria at the beginning of the trial. So in some ways, that's going to reduce the power of the trial, but it was the only right thing to do. What results do we have so far? We know that that vitamin B12 intervention, which started in some cases many years before the woman became pregnant, the B12 concentrations were higher, homocysteine came down dramatically, and the vitamin B12 status in the cord blood was improved and normalized compared with the placebo group. The babies of these women were bigger than the generation before, but there was no difference between the intervention groups. So there was no sign that this B12 intervention was improving fetal growth. The children have just been followed up at the age of 2 with cognitive function. And if I could show you the next slide, these are Bailey scale scores at the age of 2 years. That showed quite clearly that the B12 groups did better in terms of cognitive function 2 years later. Now, those children are too young to measure the insulin and glucose concentrations, but that will obviously be one of Dr. Yagnik's big interests within the next 2 or 3 years. But clear evidence that that intervention has had a long-term effect. Now, the third trial I want to tell you about is the HELTI group of trials. I don't know if you've heard of these. HELTI is actually a family of trials taking place in 4 countries: China, India, South Africa, and Canada. The intervention is a multifaceted intervention. So the idea is not to have a magic bullet but to try and give the mother a holistic package of support, nutritional support, support to deal with health issues, to avoid infection and exposure to pollution and toxins, and psychosocial support to prevent maternal depression, and also to improve parenting skills and breastfeeding. The protocols are harmonized across these 4 countries, but of course there are some very important context-specific differences. You can't have an identical intervention across all those settings. And the primary outcome is not birth weight or pregnancy outcome. The primary outcome with great vision has been chosen as an outcome in the children at 5 years, a cardiometabolic outcome. So the number 1 outcome is how fat are they, and do they have raised blood pressure, do they have raised plasma glucose? As I say, I think this is great vision on the part of the funders to be prepared to fund a study which is going to produce those outcomes in about 10 years' time. And the purpose is to inform policy on prevention, on the capability of interventions at this stage of life to prevent cardiometabolic disease. It's funded by the research councils in each of those countries in partnership with the Canadian Institutes of Health Research and WHO. And the Indian study, which has the acronym Einstein, Early Interventions to Support Trajectories for Healthy Life in India, is led by Dr. Kumaran in Mysore. It's taking place in a rural setting where there's a history of past undernutrition, but very rapid transition, and a group of people that we know are at high risk of diabetes in the very near future. It was held up by the pandemic, but started in 2021 after 2 years of formative work. And there are 3 arms to this study. All the women are recruited before conception. These are married women with only 1 or no children, intending to have more children, across 105 villages. And some will start the intervention at recruitment preconceptionally, some will start in pregnancy, and some will have standard care throughout. And at this point, I would like to acknowledge Neeta Bhandari in Delhi and the WING study, which has done a study just like this. She got to start before the pandemic and has completed the study and published some data only a few weeks ago. It's a similar multifaceted intervention, and she's shown, her group has shown, that birth weight and birth length improved, growth up to 24 months was greater, and that this effect, particularly on length, was better if the woman had the intervention throughout from preconception up to the age of 24 months. These trials that I've told you about in India are amongst trials going on all over the world by the Dohad fraternity. This is one of our trials in Southampton, a vitamin D trial. Vitamin D is a very specific deficiency problem in the UK because of our terrible weather. This was a study that gave vitamin D to mothers and has been shown to increase bone density in the offspring, and has actually led to a change in policy of prescribing vitamin D for mothers. You'll have noticed that I haven't presented any epigenetic data, metabolomic data, transcriptomic data, and that's because it's not my area. I'm an epidemiologist, and I think also it's early days for this work. But I just want to highlight the importance of this work, which we're mainly doing here in collaboration with Dr. Chandak at CCMB, so that in all of our cohort studies and trials, specimens are collected that can be used to look at epigenetic marks in the offspring of the mothers that we study. So that's the cohort studies and the trials. The trials, I think, are going to be particularly helpful in this. And then as we follow the children through birth size, childhood growth, development of cardiometabolic profiles, we'll be able to link those to those epigenetic data, looking to see what are the mechanisms, what are the changes in those fetuses that lead in later life to this metabolic problem. And I think this is so important because anyone here who has done an intervention study, particularly a preconceptional intervention study, will know that it's a huge effort and it takes a long time to get the answers. And we can't wait for all these trials to deliver. We're going to need this omic data to give us the direction to guide the trials, which will be the ultimate answers. We are seeing epigenetic changes in the children born in these trials. We're seeing transcriptomic changes. But to me, at least, they're difficult to put together at the moment into a coherent story. But I do expect that to happen over the course of time. Where would I like all this to be after 30 years of research? I'd like the public, the government, to know about DOHAD, to have it in their consciousness. I'd like it to be influencing policy to improve things for mothers and young children. I think in a general sense, people are very conscious of this work, and it has influenced policy, sometimes at government level, sometimes at WHO level, in directing more care to that part of the life course. But at the moment, it's somewhat unspecific because we don't have details of exactly how you go about that in a context-specific way. We, of course, do know what good nutrition is. We know that very well. And there's more emphasis now, as we've heard here, on diet diversity and diet quality. And that advice can be given with confidence. We think there are micronutrient deficiencies that vary in different settings around the world, and that some may be particularly more important in India, like B12, but we don't have the strong enough evidence to make that a policy change at this point. We'd like to know how to intervene to treat those known adverse early life factors, and I'm thinking here of gestational diabetes. Unfortunately, I think gestational diabetes gets more confusing as time goes on, because there are about 30 different ways of diagnosing gestational diabetes around the world and great arguments about what the cutoffs should be. And as I said earlier, it may be that pregnancy is too late. We need to show that. I'd like to see preconceptional care become a thing, a routine thing in the world, so that women could be advised about their weight before they go into pregnancy, have their micronutrient status checked, so many other things. This is a distant hope at the moment, except in the Netherlands, where they are gearing up to make this available to the entire population. We'd like to have a full understanding of the mechanisms. That is going to come with time, but is a long way off and involves a lot of work. We need more robust biomarkers for identifying those children in early life who are going to have the cardiometabolic problems later, and know how to reverse or mitigate their effects. And we'd like it if your physician would ask you what your birth weight was, whether your mother had diabetes in pregnancy, and know better how to deal with your diabetes. We don't know how to do that at the moment. So you can see that progress has been made, but there's a lot that we don't know. And we do need people like you to join this. We need people who enjoy studying mothers and children, and people who enjoy being in a lab studying histone methylation for the epigenetic studies and the transcriptome, because this is going to take an army of people to answer this very complex system and problem. I remember David Barker always used to say, there's an easy, simple answer to everything, and it'll be wrong. This is going to be complicated. So at the end of that, I'd like to finish and thank all of the colleagues that I work with here and have worked with over that period of time, all of whom are too numerous to mention. This is a photograph at the top from one of our Sneha meetings, which we hold annually to share data. And of course, my colleagues in Southampton. And I'd like to thank our funders, who are many, including ICMR and DBT here. And thank you for listening. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you, Professor Fall, for that brilliant oration. We have not done with the felicitations yet. We would like to present you the NIN Centenary Memento. I request Hemlata ma'am to present the memento to Professor Fall. I now request Shashikaran sir to give the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Professor Caroline Fall, for an extremely interesting oration. In fact, when Dr. Hemlata asked me to summarize the talk and give a concluding remark, while I started noting down all the points you were presenting, I felt it sounded more like a Sherlock Holmes mystery story. And it all started with the differential mortality for cardiovascular disease in 4 clusters which are close to each other but with different death rates, which led you to the low birth weight and maternal undernutrition as the starting point, which lead to diabetes and cardiovascular disease. And you didn't stop there. You came over to India because India has got a high prevalence of low birth weight, and then you linked up with all our fellow scientists here who had several cohort studies going on, and then it is like you had a big jigsaw puzzle. You started piecing them together, and finally you have come to a stage, and even your successful as well as unsuccessful interventional stories also led you to now almost to a final stage when maybe Giriraj Chandak finally comes up with his all his metabolomic and genomic data, the story would be complete, and then we'll go on to a policy interventions. Thank you very much, ma'am. We enjoyed every moment of your talk. Thank you. I have to thank the Oration Trust for inviting Professor Caroline, that Dr. Kamala Krishna Swamy, Professor M.S. Swaminathan, Professor Anurag Kurpad, and Dr. Prema Ramchandran from NFI. And I also thank NSI, the President, and the entire Executive Committee for organizing this oration, and my friends and colleagues and staff of NIN for making all the arrangements. Thank you.
Congratulations once again, Professor Fall, and I'd like to thank all the dignitaries for conducting the session. Thank you.
Good evening, friends. So I have 2 announcements, important announcements. Tomorrow at 8:30, general body meeting will be there here only. Please try to attend everyone. And another thing is the food is, dinner is served only after 8:40. So here some very interesting cultural program is there. Please see and enjoy and bless the people. Okay, thank you.